The square is empty except for soldiers. It is December 22nd, 1849, St. Petersburg before dawn. The cold absolute. The snow lying flat across Semyonovsky Square, in the particular stillness of a place where something is about to happen and everyone present knows it. 3 men are brought forward. Their hands are bound. One of them is young, with pale eyes and a round face that has not yet learned to hide what moves across it. His name is Fyodor Dostoevsky. He is 28 years old. He has written 1 novel. He has been awake since before dawn, and he has had many hours to think about dying. The drums begin. In accounts he gave later in his writing, he described what those minutes felt like with a consistency that suggests genuine memory rather than reconstruction. He did not close his eyes. The sky above the square was just beginning to lighten at its edges. That pale grey specific to St. Petersburg in winter, and snowflakes were still falling through it with a slowness that seemed, in that moment, almost unbearable in its beauty. He made, in those seconds, a promise to himself about how he would live if living turned out to still be available to him. Then the drums stopped. What happened next is documented in multiple accounts from those present. An official arrived carrying a message from Tsar Nicholas I. The death sentences had been commuted. The execution had been theatre. A demonstration of imperial power designed to bring these young men to the absolute edge and then pull them back. The rifles were lowered. The shrouds were removed. He stood in the snow. He was alive. He spent the next 3 decades trying to describe what he had understood in that square. Not as autobiography, as fiction, as the most honest form of inquiry available to a man who had looked directly at the question of what it means to be alive and had come back with something to say about it. This is his story. The hospital sat on the outskirts of Moscow, in a neighbourhood that had none of the city's gold domes or wide imperial boulevards. It was called the Maryinsky Hospital for the Poor, functional in the way that places built around suffering tend to be functional. Long, low, without decoration, the wards held the destitute and the incurable, people who had come here because there was nowhere else to go. At night, sounds moved through the walls of the attached doctors' quarters. The smells of illness and carbolic and unwashed bodies were part of the air. The children who grew up there breathed without thinking about it. The way children absorb whatever surrounds them before they have language for what they are absorbing. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born on November 11th, 1821, in those quarters. His father, Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky, was the staff physician, a man who had risen from modest origins through discipline and medical training, and who ran his household with the same severity he applied to everything else. His mother, Maria Fyodorovna, came from a Moscow merchant family and brought into the marriage a warmth and a religious feeling that softened, at least in the domestic hours, what the father's strictness produced. They were not poor, but they lived directly against poverty, in the most physical sense possible. The patients who moved through the courtyard were visible from the children's windows. The men and women in the wards were audible through the walls. Fyodor and his older brother, Mikhail, grew up watching human suffering at close range before they had frameworks for understanding what they were seeing. This matters more than it might initially seem. Most writers encounter suffering as adults, when they already have vocabularies for it. Systems of thought that help organize what they observe. Dostoevsky encountered it as a small child. It entered him before any defenses were in place. It did not become material he could observe from a safe distance. It became the texture of ordinary life. His father was a complicated figure, and the historical record has never settled into a simple portrait of him. What the surviving accounts agree on is that he worked hard, loved his children in his particular fashion, and carried pressures that he did not always manage gracefully. He taught his sons Latin himself in the evenings. He supervised their early education with genuine attention. He drank, though accounts differ on the extent. He was, by most indications, a man who wanted more for his children than he had been given, and who expressed that wanting in ways that his children sometimes experienced as harshness. The emotional centre of those early years was the mother. Maria Fyodorovna read to her children constantly. She read them Pushkin and the old folk tales that moved through Russian households like inherited air. She took them to church and explained what they were hearing in language a child could hold. She had a gift for making the sacred feel immediate rather than distant, for communicating without theology that the stories in the Gospels were not ancient history, but descriptions of something present in the world right now, in this room, available to this child. When Fyodor was 3 years old, she sat beside him and read him the book of Job, the story of a man who loses everything, who suffers without having earned his suffering, who demands an answer from God and receives one that is not an answer at all, but something stranger and more unsettling. Whether he understood it at 3 is beside the point. The story lodged. He returned to it throughout his life. It surfaces in almost everything he ever wrote, in one form or another, as the question beneath all his other questions. The family spent summers at a small property called Darovoy, about 100 miles from Moscow. These were, by his own later account, the happiest periods of his childhood. The constraints of the hospital apartment fell away. He and Mikhail ran through birch forests, explored the surrounding fields, spent long afternoons among the peasant children who lived on the estate. The quality of light through birch leaves in late summer appears again and again in his fiction, always carrying something close to the sacred. He was storing these summers without knowing he was storing them. He was 10 years old when his mother fell seriously ill. Tuberculosis moved through her slowly at first. There were better periods and worse ones. She continued to read to her children, continued her prayers, continued managing the household with the particular competence of a woman who has decided that the illness will not be permitted to define the available hours. But the disease was progressing, and everyone in the family understood this, including Fyodor, who watched his mother with the helpless attention of a child who has not yet learned that some things cannot be fixed by paying close enough attention. She died on February 27th, 1837. Fyodor was 15. His brother Mikhail wept openly. His father fell into a grief that would alter the years that followed. Fyodor became quieter, in ways that those around him noticed but did not fully understand. He was already developing what would become his most consistent survival habit, pressing what was most painful down into some interior space where it could be examined rather than simply endured. Whether this was a gift or a cost is a question his entire body of work can be read as attempting to answer. 3 months after his mother's death, his father sent him and Mikhail to St. Petersburg to sit the entrance examination for the Nikolaev Military Engineering Academy. The plan had been forming for some time. Engineering offered stability, a path into the professional class. That neither boy had expressed any particular interest in engineering was not, in the father's framework, a relevant consideration. The journey took several days by coach. The roads were rough. The flat Russian landscape moved past the windows with its particular indifference to whatever was happening inside the carriage. Somewhere on that journey, Dostoevsky heard news of Pushkin's death. Alexander Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet, had been killed in a duel in February of that year. The news had not reached the family immediately, and Fyodor was only now learning of it. He told his brother he wanted to wear mourning for Pushkin as he would for a member of his own family. The two losses arrived in him together. His mother and his country's greatest writer, close enough in time that they became, in his interior life, a single wound with two sources. He was already someone for whom literature was not decoration, but a primary emotional reality, as real and as consequential as any human relationship. The engineering academy was everything the hospital apartment was not: formal, hierarchical, governed by military discipline that left very little space for interior life. The curriculum covered mathematics, fortifications, technical drawing, precise and demanding, and almost entirely indifferent to the questions that actually interested him. His father died in June of 1839. While Fyodor was still at the academy, the official account recorded apoplexy as the cause. An alternative account, which circulated among people who knew the family, held that he was killed by serfs on the Darovoy estate. The historical record has never definitively resolved the question, and Dostoevsky himself never addressed it directly in any surviving document. What is certain is that the news shook him in ways visible in his letters from that period, and that the unresolved question of what had actually happened to his father stayed with him. Some biographers have connected this to his lifelong preoccupation with the theme of the murdered father, a connection that the work itself may confirm or may not, depending on how you read it. He graduated from the academy in 1843. He accepted a position as a junior draftsman. He reported for duty. He lasted approximately 1 year. What he was actually doing during that year was reading. He read with the focused hunger of someone who has discovered that literature is the only available answer to the questions he actually has. He read Schiller and Shakespeare and Victor Hugo. He read E.T.A. Hoffmann, whose stories of psychological disintegration described something Dostoevsky recognized from somewhere inside himself. He read Balzac with particular intensity, learning enough French to get closer to the original, studying how the French writer rendered the interior lives of ordinary people with precision and without condescension. He also began to write, not seriously at first, fragments, circling. He was reaching towards something he could not yet name. In 1844, he resigned his engineering commission. Everyone who knew him was alarmed. He had a guaranteed position, a modest income, a professional identity that would protect him from exactly the poverty he had watched through the hospital windows as a child. To give it up was, by any practical measure, a significant gamble. He resigned anyway. He moved into a cheap room and began to write in earnest. He was 23 years old, with no publishing connections and no guarantee that anyone would ever read what he was producing. He had only the conviction that this was the only thing he was capable of doing that was worth doing. The manuscript took nearly a year. 2 characters exchanging letters, a poor government clerk named Makar Devushkin and a young woman named Varvara Dobrozalova, both without social standing, both slowly being destroyed by circumstances entirely beyond their control, both insisting through the simple act of writing to each other that their lives mattered, that their experience deserved to be witnessed. He called it Poor Folk. In the spring of 1845, he gave the manuscript to his friend Dmitry Grigorovich, who brought it to the poet Nikolai Nekrasov. According to Grigorovich's later account, Nekrasov began reading it that evening and could not stop. He and Grigorovich stayed up together until 4 in the morning. Then, still in the hours before dawn, they walked to Dostoevsky's apartment and knocked on his door. He answered in his nightclothes. Nekrasov embraced him. He told him the work was extraordinary. The next day, Nekrasov brought the manuscript to Vissarion Belinsky, the most powerful literary critic in Russia. Belinsky read it and produced a verdict that travelled through St. Petersburg's literary world within days. A new Gogol has appeared. Dostoevsky was 23 years old. He had been a known writer for less than 48 hours. The boy from the hospital in Moscow, the boy who had grown up watching, suffering through a window, had found the form for what he had been carrying since childhood. The weight of it had not diminished. It never would. But now, at last, he had somewhere to put it. The literary world of St. Petersburg in 1845 was small enough that news travelled fast and consequential enough that its judgments carried real weight. Within weeks of Belinsky's verdict, Dostoevsky found himself in rooms he had never expected to enter. Evening gatherings where the serious intellectual life of the city conducted itself over strong tea and arguments that went on past midnight. The air in these rooms, reconstructed from the memoirs of those who attended, carried pipe smoke and the particular energy of people who believe that ideas have consequences. Conversations moved between French and Russian without announcement, as if the border between the 2 languages was simply another thing that educated people in St. Petersburg did not feel obliged to observe. He was not prepared for any of it. He had spent the previous several years in near total isolation, living in cheap rooms, eating poorly, reading everything he could find. The sudden visibility was intoxicating and disorienting in equal measure. He was 23, physically unremarkable, with a round, pale face and light eyes that shifted visibly with whatever he was feeling. He was not good at the kind of easy social performance that salon life rewarded, but he was electric in conversation when the subject was something he actually cared about, which was literature and human nature and the question of how a person was supposed to live in a world that provided no reliable answers to that question. The response to his second published work would test all of this. He called it The Double, where Poor Folk had been warm in its treatment of its characters. The Double was stranger and colder. It followed a government clerk named Golyadkin, who begins to encounter, with growing horror, an exact duplicate of himself. The Double is everything Golyadkin is not. Socially confident, professionally successful, charming to the people whose approval Golyadkin cannot stop wanting. He moves through the world with an ease that the original Golyadkin cannot manage, and as the story progresses, the Double displaces him, erases him from his own life so completely that by the end it is no longer clear which version is real. The story drew on the German Romantic tradition of tales about psychological disintegration, but it was doing something that tradition had not quite done. It was using the apparatus of the uncanny not to produce horror for its own sake, but to describe something specific about the experience of being a person who cannot reconcile what he is with what he believes he ought to be. Golyadkin is not being haunted. He is being confronted. When The Double appeared in January of 1846, the response was swift and largely negative. Poor Folk was praised. The Double was not. The critics found it overwrought, unclear, excessive. Even Belinsky was lukewarm. He acknowledged talent, but suggested the story demonstrated a tendency toward indulgence that the younger writer would need to control. Dostoevsky was devastated, not because negative criticism was unexpected in literary life, but because he knew with the particular certainty that a writer sometimes has about their own work that The Double was reaching towards something important, something that the social realism dominating Russian fiction in the 1840s did not have a framework for receiving. He spent the next several years writing and publishing short fiction, producing stories at a pace driven partly by genuine creative energy and partly by the financial necessity of a man who was already in debt. Patterns were forming within these stories. He was drawn again and again to characters who existed at the margins of Russian society. Minor officials, poor students, women with no social protection, people whose lives were determined by forces entirely beyond their control and who nonetheless maintained, within those constraints, interior lives of extraordinary complexity. He was learning to enter his characters in a way that went deeper than anything in the dominant literary tradition of the time. He did not stand above them and observe from a comfortable distance. He went inside and thought their thoughts, felt their embarrassments, shared their delusions. His relationship with Belinsky was changing during these years, and the change mattered. The older critic had a strong ideological agenda for Russian literature. He believed that fiction should serve social progress, that the proper subject of the Russian novel was the suffering produced by unjust arrangements, and that the proper response was political reform. He was moving, in the late 1840s, toward atheistic materialism, toward the position that human problems were fundamentally problems of social organization, solvable through reason and political will. Dostoevsky could not follow him there. He had grown up with his mother's religious feeling. He had absorbed the Gospels as a child and the Book of Job as something almost physical. He believed, not always comfortably, and not without significant internal conflict, but with a stubbornness that intellectual argument could not entirely dislodge, that the suffering he had observed from childhood ran deeper than politics, that the question of how to live was not reducible to the question of how society was organized, that something in the human condition resisted the clean solutions that progressive ideology was offering. When Belinsky argued that Christ was simply a product of his historical moment, Dostoevsky pushed back. When Belinsky insisted that socialism offered the only genuine hope for human dignity, Dostoevsky was skeptical in ways the older man found baffling. The friendship cooled. By 1847, the warmth of the early period had been replaced by a mutual recognition that they were travelling in different directions. In the winter of 1846, Dostoevsky had begun attending meetings of a discussion group organized by a minor official named Mikhail Petrushevsky. The group met on Friday evenings and drew an eclectic collection of young men writers, students, teachers, minor civil servants, all of them broadly progressive in their political sympathies, all of them sharing a dissatisfaction with the autocratic regime of Tsar Nicholas I, and a desire to discuss ideas that could not be safely discussed anywhere else. Dostoevsky came primarily because it was a place where serious conversation happened. He listened more than he spoke in the early months. He was absorbing, as he always did, taking the measure of the people around him, filing away observations about how they argued and what they believed, and whether the gap between their stated principles and their actual behaviour was large or small. He was not thinking of consequences. In Europe, in 1848, revolutions broke out across the continent. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas watched with alarm and responded by tightening the censorship apparatus. The space for free discussion, never large, was getting smaller. The Petrushevsky circle grew more urgent. Some members were moving toward more radical positions. There was talk of a secret printing press. There was discussion of the serfs, the great unaddressed wound of Russian life. Dostoevsky participated, sometimes with genuine passion. He read aloud, at one of the Friday meetings, a letter that Belinsky had written to the novelist Gogol, a letter so direct in its criticism of the Tsar and the Church that its circulation was forbidden. He read it clearly. He believed the things it said were true, and that true things deserved to be heard. The agents of the third section, the Tsar's secret police, had been monitoring the circle for months. They had informants inside. By the spring of 1849, they had what they needed. On the night of April 23rd, 1849, Dostoevsky went to bed at around 2 in the morning. He had been writing late. He was 27 years old. In debt, not yet producing the second great work that would confirm the promise of poor folk, but working, always working. At 4 in the morning, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find a police officer and several soldiers. His papers were confiscated. His apartment was searched. Everything written was taken. He was brought to the Peter and Paul fortress, placed in a cell, and the door was locked behind him. Outside, the city was still dark. He would spend the next 8 months learning what silence actually contains. The cell in the Peter and Paul fortress had a cot, a table, a candle replaced each day. He was permitted to receive food from outside and, after some weeks, to request books. He was interrogated periodically by officials of the third section, who asked him to account for his attendance at the Petrushevsky meetings. For his reading of Belinsky's letter, he answered carefully, acknowledging what could not be denied, trying where he could to protect others in the group. What he could not do was right. For a man who had organized his entire interior life around the act of writing, this was its own particular torment. He had no paper, no pen. The thoughts that came in the silence, the ideas, the characters beginning to take shape, had nowhere to go. He composed sentences in his head and repeated them to himself until they became unforgettable. He was doing what the prisoner does, who knows he will someday need to retrieve what he has stored. The months passed slowly. Summer came, and then fall. The Neva changed colour through the small window. Dostoevsky read when he was allowed to read, and thought when he was not. And gradually, in the long solitude, something began to clarify. He had been, before his arrest, a young man with strong feelings and incomplete ideas. He had felt the injustice of the Russian social order with genuine moral force. He had been drawn to the progressive circles of St. Petersburg because they took ideas seriously, but he had not been a true believer in any systematic sense. He had not fully committed himself to any of the ideological frameworks those circles were offering. In the cell, without the noise of those discussions, without the social pressure of group membership, he was left alone with the actual content of what he believed, and what he found, examining it carefully in the quiet, was not ideology. It was something older and less systematic, a sense that the suffering of human beings was real in a way that no political program could entirely account for, that the question of how to respond to it was not finally a political question, but something deeper. These were not conclusions he could have stated clearly in the spring of 1849. They were more like orientations, pressures, the beginning of positions that would take years to become anything fully formed. But the cell was where they began to solidify. The cell was, though he did not know it yet, the first classroom of his real education. The trial was conducted by a military tribunal in the fall of 1849. The proceedings were closed. The evidence was the documented record of the Friday meetings. On November 13th, 1849, the sentence was announced. Dostoevsky and 20 of his associates were condemned to death by firing squad. He wrote a letter to his brother Mikhail. The letter survives. It is not what a person might expect from a man who has just been told he is going to die. He told Mikhail he was not losing hope. He told him that life was a gift, and that he had perhaps not appreciated it as fully as he should have. He asked Mikhail to look after their brothers and sister. He said he had plans, things he wanted to write, if he was given the time. The morning of December 22nd, 1849 was dark and cold in the way that late December mornings are dark and cold in St. Petersburg, the sun not rising until mid-morning, the sky a flat grey that holds no warmth. Dostoevsky and his fellow condemned men were taken from the fortress before dawn and driven through empty streets to Semyonovsky Square. A platform stood at the centre. Soldiers were assembled in formation. A crowd had gathered at the edges, standing in the grey morning light at what they judged to be a respectful distance. A priest read the last rites. Each man was offered the cross to kiss. Dostoevsky kissed it. White shrouds were brought out, and the prisoners were dressed in them. The effect of the cloth against the skin was, by later accounts, from those present, immediate and complete. Whatever theoretical understanding of the situation the prisoners had carried through 8 months of imprisonment became, in that moment, physical and irrevocable. They were divided into groups of 3. Dostoevsky was in the second group. He would watch the first 3 men die before his turn came. The first group was led to the posts and tied. The rifles were raised. The drums rolled. Then an official arrived at the edge of the square. What happened next is documented in multiple accounts from those present. The execution had been theatre from the beginning. Tsar Nicholas I had never intended to carry out the sentences. He had intended to bring these young men to the absolute edge and then pull them back. The commutation was read aloud. The rifles were lowered. One man in the first group, a writer named Nikolai Grigoriev, broke under the experience. His mind gave way in those minutes and never fully recovered. Dostoevsky did not break, but he was not unchanged. In accounts he gave later in his writing, he described what those minutes felt like with a consistency that suggests genuine memory. He described the acute visibility of everything around him, the specific grey of the sky, the faces of the soldiers, the snowflakes still falling. He described the way time seemed to reorganize itself. He described making a promise to himself. What he promised, he did not record precisely, but the work that followed can be read as the keeping of it. The new sentences were announced. Dostoevsky would serve 4 years of hard labour in Siberia, followed by 4 years as a common soldier. His brother Mikhail was permitted to visit briefly in the prison corridor before the departure. Mikhail wept. Dostoevsky was calm, not the calm of a man who does not understand what is happening, but the calm of a man who has passed through something and arrived on the other side, at something he had not previously had. He told Mikhail to expect great things. On the night of December 24th, 1849, Christmas Eve by the Russian calendar, he was placed in an open sleigh in the courtyard of the Peter and Paul fortress. His legs were put in irons. A fur coat had been donated by a charitable woman who learned that prisoners were being sent east in December without adequate clothing, and pressed into his coat pocket by the wives of Decembrist exiles who had come to the convoy stop specifically to give them to prisoners, was a small copy of the New Testament. That New Testament would be the only book he was permitted to own for the next 4 years. The sleigh moved through the frozen streets of St. Petersburg into the Christmas Eve darkness. The city fell away behind him. He had work to do. He did not yet know what form it would take. He only knew, with the certainty of a man who has looked directly at the question and survived it, that it needed to be done. The journey to Omsk took 3 weeks across the frozen steppe. They travelled by sleigh, changing horses at relay stations spaced across the flat interior of Russia. Each station a small island of warmth and noise in the vast white silence. The cold of central Siberia in January is a different order of cold from anything the European part of Russia produces, unmodified by proximity to water, unbroken by any feature of the landscape. The steppe in every direction, flat and white and silent, as if the world had been stripped to its most basic components and left there. At the relay station in Tobolsk, something happened that, by his own later account, Dostoevsky would carry for the rest of his life. The wives of Decembrist exiles, women who had followed their condemned husbands into Siberian imprisonment nearly a quarter-century earlier and who had remained after their husbands died, had heard that a new convoy of political prisoners was passing through. They arranged to meet the convoy. They brought food and warm clothing, and they brought, for each prisoner, a copy of the Gospels with a 10-ruble note folded inside the binding. One of these women, Natalia von Vizina, approached the convoy at the station. As Dostoevsky described it years afterward, she took his hands in hers and held them for a moment. She was old enough to be his mother. She had spent 20 years in Siberia because she had chosen to follow a man she loved into punishment. She said something to him that he could not fully hear over the noise of the station, but that he understood. He wrote later, from her face. He kept the memory of that encounter, its surfaces, transformed and deepened, in nearly every female character he ever wrote, who demonstrates, without argument or ideology, that love expressed through presence is the most radical thing a human being can offer another. The prison camp at Omsk was enclosed by a high wooden palisade that blocked the view in every direction. Inside were the barracks, where prisoners slept on plank beds in rows, and the workshop, and the small yard where they were permitted to walk during the brief intervals between work periods. There was nothing decorative about any of it. Every element existed to contain and to exhaust. Dostoevsky entered the camp in January of 1850. He was 28 years old. The other prisoners were not political detainees. They were criminals in the fullest sense. Men who had committed murders, some of them multiple murders. Thieves who had graduated from petty crime to violent crime. Men who had done things that Dostoevsky could barely yet imagine, and who were entirely unsurprised to be where they were. The Russian prison system of the 1850s made no accommodation for the sensibilities of educated men who had been arrested for reading forbidden letters aloud at private gatherings. He was placed among these men and expected to live alongside them for 4 years. His fellow prisoners knew immediately that he was different. He spoke differently. He had the hands and the manner of someone who had never done physical labour. This made him, in the social world of the camp, an outsider of a specific and uncomfortable kind. The peasant criminals who made up the majority of the prison population had a deep and not irrational distrust of educated men, of the class that had owned their grandparents as property, that had administered the laws under which they had been sentenced. The distrust was not abstract. It was in every glance, every silence, every small withholding of the basic social courtesy that makes communal life bearable. He spent the first weeks in a sustained shock that he later described carefully in his writing, not primarily the shock of physical suffering. Though the physical conditions were genuinely brutal, the shock of proximity, of being placed, without any buffer or distance, inside the lives of people he had previously written about, from a position of imaginative sympathy but fundamental separation. That separation was now gone. He slept 2 feet from men who had killed. He ate from the same bowls. He performed the same work, breaking rocks and hauling earth and carrying loads that his body, never strong, found genuinely difficult. He had no private space, no quiet corner where he could retreat into the interior life that had always been his primary home. Privacy was the first thing the camp removed. And for Dostoevsky, it was among the most costly losses. He was permitted no writing materials. He composed in his head, as he had done in the Peter and Paul fortress. But the conditions here were far less conducive to sustained mental work. The noise, the exhaustion, the constant proximity of other people. So he watched instead. He developed, over the months and years of his imprisonment, a capacity for attentiveness that went beyond anything he had practiced before. He could not write what he observed, but he could remember it. He stored faces, voices, the way a man held his body when describing something that shamed him, the specific register of laughter in the prison yard on Sunday afternoons when the work was suspended. He was building, without fully knowing it, an archive that would supply his fiction for the rest of his writing life. What he discovered in that archive surprised him. He had come to Omsk with assumptions broadly consistent with the progressive ideology of Belinsky's circle. The men here were victims of an unjust social order. Their crimes were the product of poverty and oppression. If the conditions of their lives had been different, they would have been different. This position was not without truth, but it was not the whole truth. Some of the men in the camp had done terrible things with what appeared to be genuine relish. Some were capable of cruelty that was not a response to their circumstances, but an expression of something in their nature that circumstances had not created and that circumstances alone could not explain. There was a man in the camp who had murdered a family, including the children, and who carried the weight of this in no way that was externally visible. He was, in many respects, an ordinary man who had done an extraordinary thing and had arranged it internally in the same category as the other things he had done. This observation was the crack in the framework, not a refutation of the progressive critique, which was still largely correct in its account of Russian society, but a recognition that the framework was incomplete, that there was something in human nature, something that could not be explained away by reference to social conditions, that was capable of genuine evil, that any honest account of human life had to look at this directly rather than explaining it away. This was the beginning of the vision that would eventually produce Raskolnikov, Stavrogin, Ivan Karamazov. The vision of the human being as a creature capable of both extraordinary love and extraordinary darkness, both real, both irreducible, neither one capable of being wished away by any ideology, however well-intentioned. But he also discovered, among the same men, something that pulled in the opposite direction entirely. There were men in the camp who had committed serious crimes and who carried what they had done in ways that were visible in everything about them. A peasant who fasted on the anniversaries of his crime and prayed with a fervour that the guards found excessive. A thief who gave away the extra food he managed to acquire to the weakest men in the barracks. An older man who had spent decades in the camp and who had developed, in that time, a quality of patience and acceptance that was not resignation, but something closer to genuine peace. These men were religious in the way that Russian peasants were religious, not theologically, but immediately, not through doctrine, but through habit and ritual, and a relationship with the sacred that required no intellectual justification. They believed in God the way they believed in the winter cold, as a fact of existence rather than a position to be argued for. Dostoevsky, whose faith had been considerably complicated by his years in St. Petersburg's secular intellectual circles, found himself drawn to these men in ways he had not expected. Their faith was not sophisticated. It would not have survived 10 minutes in one of Belinsky's salon discussions. But it was alive in a way that the sophisticated positions he had encountered in those discussions were not. He read his New Testament in the brief intervals when reading was possible. He read it not as intellectual exercise, but as something closer to the way the peasants around him read it. Seeking something immediate and sustaining, he was not abandoning thought. He was discovering that thought alone was not sufficient, that there were things that could only be addressed by a different part of a person entirely. The epilepsy that would mark the rest of his life announced itself clearly during his years in Omsk. He had experienced what may have been episodes earlier, but the condition became undeniable in the camp. The seizures were frightening to witness, but what he described, in the seconds immediately before a seizure began, was something he found almost impossible to communicate in ordinary language. A feeling of complete harmony, of everything in existence being exactly as it should be, so total that the suffering which followed seemed, he wrote later, a fair price to pay. He used this experience with care and precision in his fiction. It is not incidental to who his epileptic characters are. It is central to what they understand. He was released from the camp in February of 1854. He walked out through the wooden palisade into the Siberian winter, thinner than he had entered, older in ways that had nothing to do with calendar years, carrying in his memory an education that no university in Russia could have provided. 4 years inside the fullest available range of human experience, from the most degraded to the most unexpectedly elevated. He was 32 years old. He was closer to ready than he had ever been. He did not yet know entirely what for, but the not knowing was, for the first time in years, something that felt like possibility rather than emptiness. The army posting at Semipalatinsk was not liberation, but it offered something that Omsk had not. He could write again. Paper. Pen. The evenings after his military duties were completed. He began slowly, the way a person begins to use a limb that has been immobilized for a long time, cautiously, testing whether the thing still works. The sentences came back. The habit of thought that organized itself around composition reasserted itself. He was not producing anything finished in those early months, but he was writing, and the act of writing was itself a restoration of something he had not fully understood he needed until it was taken from him. He also, in Semipalatinsk, fell in love. Her name was Maria Dmitrievna Isaeva. She was the wife of a local customs official, educated by the standards of provincial Siberia, attractive in ways that photographs from the period confirm. She had arrived in Semipalatinsk with her husband and their young son, and had found it, as any cultivated person would find it, isolating and dull. When Dostoevsky appeared in the town's small social world, she recognized in him something that Semipalatinsk had not previously offered, a mind that was genuinely alive. The friendship developed quickly into something more complicated. Dostoevsky fell for Maria Dmitrievna with the completeness of a man for whom ordinary emotional experience already operates at several degrees above normal temperature. He was constitutionally unsuited for the management of complicated situations of the heart, and he expressed what he felt with a directness that could be overwhelming. He wrote to his brother Mikhail about his feelings in letters of considerable fervour. Maria's husband Alexander was chronically ill and died in August of 1855. Dostoevsky was now free to pursue her directly, but she had moved with her son to a town called Kuznetsk, several days' journey away, and she was uncertain about him, attracted, but aware of his precarious situation, his convict status, his lack of income, the general difficulty of a life built around him. She was also, during this period, involved with a young schoolteacher named Nikolai Virganov, who had fewer complications and more predictable prospects. She told Dostoevsky about Virganov. He was tormented. His letters to Mikhail from this period document an anguish that was entirely genuine. But circumstances were shifting. His friend Alexander Wrangel, a young baron posted to Semipalatinsk as a government official who had become one of Dostoevsky's closest companions during these years, was working through his connections in St. Petersburg to improve Dostoevsky's situation. The new Tsar, Alexander II, whose early reign showed signs of greater liberality toward political prisoners, allowed the efforts to proceed. Through Wrangel's advocacy, Dostoevsky was promoted to officer's rank in 1856. His civil rights were partially restored. The possibility of returning to St. Petersburg was becoming less theoretical. He married Maria Dmitrievna in February of 1857 in Kuznetsk. It was not a marriage that began in simple happiness. She was choosing him out of a complex mixture of genuine feeling, practical necessity, and the particular resolution that a widowed woman with a child in provincial Siberia brings to the available options. She cared for him, in her way, but she was also, in ways that would become clear over the following years, not capable of being made whole by what he could offer. On their wedding night, Dostoevsky had an epileptic seizure. Maria, who had not known about the condition, was frightened in a way that the start of a marriage cannot easily absorb. It was the first of many difficult things. They were not well suited. Maria was volatile, given to moods that swung without apparent relation to external events. She was possessive in ways that Dostoevsky, with his own considerable insecurities, found both comprehensible and exhausting. Her lungs were already beginning to fail. Her son, Pasha, whom Dostoevsky adopted and genuinely tried to love, was a difficult child who would become a more difficult adult. Dostoevsky attended to all of it. He was constitutionally incapable of abandoning people who needed him, even when the needing was complicated, even when the cost to his own work was significant. This quality, which, in his fiction, would produce some of the most extraordinary portraits of human compassion in the literary tradition, produced in his private life a series of relationships that drained him steadily. He was given permission to return to St. Petersburg in December of 1859. 10 years after his arrest, he was 38 years old. The Russia of 1859 was different from the Russia of 1849. Alexander II's early reign had brought genuine liberalization. The censorship was less suffocating. The emancipation of the serfs, unthinkable under Nicholas, was being seriously discussed. Into this changed landscape, Dostoevsky arrived with manuscripts he had been developing in Siberia and with the hunger of a man who has lost a decade and cannot afford to lose more. He and his brother Mikhail launched a literary journal called Vremya, meaning time. In 1861, the journal published The House of the Dead in serialized form, his fictionalized account of the Omsk years, and the response was significant. Russian readers encountering an account of prison life written by someone who had actually lived it, written without sentimentality but with the specific gravity of direct observation, recognized that they were reading something unlike anything they had read before. He was re-establishing himself, slowly, unevenly, with the grinding persistence of a man who has lost years and cannot afford sentiment about it. Then, in 1862, he went to Europe for the first time. He went partly for health reasons, partly out of genuine curiosity about the civilization he had read about all his life, but never seen. The progressive intellectuals of St. Petersburg spoke of Europe as the model toward which Russia should aspire. Dostoevsky wanted to see the model with his own eyes. What he saw in London disturbed him. He walked through working-class districts at night and saw what poverty looked like in the middle of enormous wealth, which is a different and in some ways more corrosive thing than poverty in conditions of general scarcity. He saw children in the streets past midnight. He saw the Crystal Palace, that great glass monument to industrial capitalism's confidence in its own future, and felt something he could not immediately name, but that would eventually find its way into his fiction as a symbol of everything that rational utopia gets wrong about human beings. And in Wiesbaden, Germany, He entered a casino for the first time. The experience was immediate. He sat at the roulette table and felt, in those first minutes, something he recognized from somewhere else. The same compression of time, the same acute sensitivity to every surrounding detail, the same suspension of ordinary consciousness. The nearness of an outcome that could not be controlled. The moment between the spin and the result in which everything was still possible. He won that first day. He was certain he had found a system. He had not found a system. There was no system, but the certainty that he had found one, and the compulsion to return, and the inability to stop once the losses began, would recur over the following years with a regularity that suggests something structural rather than simply poor judgment. The gambling was not primarily about money. It was about the experience, about putting himself voluntarily back into the condition where everything was at stake and nothing could be predicted. He understood this about himself. He wrote about it honestly in letters and eventually in fiction. Understanding did not stop it. He returned to St. Petersburg. He wrote and edited and accumulated debts with equal energy. He fell into the company of a young woman named Apollinaria Suslova, intelligent and considerably younger than he was, who became his lover and who provided, over the following 2 years, a relationship of considerable mutual unhappiness that both of them appear to have found, at some level, necessary. In 1864, the journal Vremya was shut down by the censors. A replacement called Epocha, meaning epoch, struggled from the start. Then, in April of 1864, Maria Dmitrievna died. She had been declining for months, her lungs giving out in the slow way that tuberculosis accomplished its work in an era before effective treatment existed. Dostoevsky was with her at the end. He felt, in ways that surprised him given the difficulty of their marriage, something genuine, not the love he had imagined when he married her, but a recognition of her suffering as real and as undeserved, and a grief for the woman she might have been in different circumstances. 3 months later, his brother Mikhail died. Dostoevsky was 43 years old. His wife was dead. His brother was dead. The journal was failing. His debts were catastrophic. He had the epilepsy and the memory of Siberia and the enormous unwritten books pressing against the inside of his skull, demanding to be let out. He sat down and wrote Notes from Underground. Un long monologue. A man with no name, living in deliberate isolation, speaking directly to the reader with a ferocity and a self-awareness that Russian literature had not previously produced in this form. The underground man is not sympathetic in any conventional sense. He is petty, vindictive, consumed by resentments he cannot overcome. He is aware of every one of his failures and cannot stop performing them, and he argues, with genuine logical force, against the progressive belief that human beings are fundamentally rational, that they will always choose what is in their best interest once they understand what it is. They will not, he insists. Sometimes they choose suffering over comfort, freedom over their own well-being, irrationality over reason, simply to prove that they are not machines, simply to demonstrate that no crystal palace of rational utopia, however perfectly designed, can contain the full range of what a human being is capable of wanting. It was the most direct statement Dostoevsky had yet made of the central argument of his entire body of work. Written in the ruins of everything he had built since his return from Siberia, broke, grieving, in debt, 43 years old, and in the deepest creative period of his life. The great books were coming. They were forming in the darkness of these desperate years, finding their shape in the very chaos that by ordinary logic should have prevented him from writing at all. He just needed to survive long enough to write them. The contract Dostoevsky signed with the publisher Fyodor Dostoevsky in the summer of 1865 was the kind of agreement that a man signs when he has no alternatives and knows it. The terms were clear and brutal. Dostoevsky would pay 3,000 rubles immediately, enough to clear the most pressing debts. In return, Dostoevsky would deliver a complete novel of at least 160 pages by November 1st of 1866. If he failed to deliver by that date, Dostoevsky would acquire the right to publish everything Dostoevsky had written or would write for the following 9 years, without any further payment. The clause was not standard publishing practice. It was a trap. Dostoevsky understood it as a trap when he signed it. He took the money and went to Wiesbaden. The money disappeared across the roulette tables with a speed that he later described in letters with something approaching dark humour. The system failed, as it always failed. He borrowed from Apollinaria Suslova, who was in the city. He wrote to Ivan Turgenev, the great Russian novelist, and borrowed 50 thalers. Turgenev lent them and would not forget it. By the time Dostoevsky returned to St. Petersburg in the fall of 1865, almost nothing remained of the 3,000 rubles. He had the debt to Dostoevsky, he had the casino, and he had, pressing against the inside of his skull, with the urgency of something that can no longer be deferred, the outline of a novel. He had been thinking about it in pieces for some time. A young man, a murder. Not a murder committed in passion or desperation, but a murder committed as a philosophical experiment, an attempt to test a theory about exceptional human beings and their relationship to ordinary moral constraint. The theory was not invented for the novel. It was in the air of the 1860s in Russia, carried by the nihilist movement that had emerged in the decade since Dostoevsky's return from Siberia. The nihilists broadly held that the inherited moral framework of Russian society had no rational basis and deserved no rational allegiance. What replaced it was a hard materialism that recognized only what could be empirically demonstrated, and a utilitarian ethics that calculated the value of actions solely by their measurable consequences. Some of what they argued was true. The conditions of Russian life were genuinely unjust. The desire to change those conditions was genuinely admirable. But Dostoevsky could see, with the clarity of a man who had watched the human capacity for cruelty in its most undisguised form for 4 years in Omsk, where a particular version of this reasoning ended, the idea that extraordinary individuals were not bound by the moral constraints applying to ordinary people, that history was advanced by men willing to step over conventional limitations in the service of a higher purpose. This was something he had seen the interior of. He had watched men in the camp who had constructed justifications for what they had done, and he had watched those justifications fail to provide what the men who constructed them had hoped they would provide. The novel was going to be about that gap, about what happens when a theory meets the reality of what you have done, about guilt, not as a social or legal consequence, but as a psychological fact. something built into human consciousness at a level that no amount of philosophical sophistication can dissolve. He began writing in the fall of 1865 and sent the first installment to the journal Ruski Vestnik, which had agreed to publish the novel in monthly installments. He wrote at night, as he always did, his best hours being those between midnight and 4 in the morning, when the city was quiet and the particular quality of concentration his work required was most accessible. Raskolnikov took shape over those autumn and winter months with the specific urgency of a character who has been waiting to exist. A student, thin and poor and brilliant, living in a room so small that it pressed against him physically, carrying in his head a theory about the division of humanity into ordinary people, who were bound by conventional morality and served the function of reproducing the species, and extraordinary people, Napoleons, who were permitted by the logic of their own greatness to step outside conventional morality in the service of their historical mission. The murder Raskolnikov commits, the killing of an old pawnbroker woman and her innocent half-sister who arrives at the wrong moment, is intended by him as a test of this theory. He is testing whether he belongs to the category of the extraordinary. It does not hold. The remainder of the novel, which is among the most sustained and precise accounts of psychological disintegration in the history of fiction, follows Raskolnikov through the aftermath as the theory collapses under the weight of what he has actually done. He does not feel liberated. He feels ill. He does not feel the clean clarity of a man who has successfully stepped outside moral constraint. He feels the specific contamination of a man who has committed an act that his own consciousness cannot contain, and the contamination spreads through everything he touches. Dostoevsky was not writing from theory. He was writing from 4 years of watching men in Omsk who had killed, who lived with what they had done in every possible way. From the complete blankness of the man who felt nothing, to the consuming guilt of the man who could not look at another human being without seeing the reflection of his crime. He had stored all of this in the years when he could not write, and now it was coming out with a precision and a force that surprised even him. He was also, simultaneously, facing the Stilovsky deadline. November 1st of 1866 was approaching, and he had not written a single page of the novel he owed the publisher. He had been entirely consumed by crime and punishment. But if he did not deliver to Stilovsky by November 1st, he would lose the rights to 9 years of his work. His friend, the poet Apollon Maikov, suggested a solution. A stenographer? If Dostoevsky dictated rather than wrote by hand, he could produce the required pages in a fraction of the time. He could dictate during the day and continue Crime and Punishment at night. The stenographer who was recommended to him was named Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. She was 20 years old. She had recently completed a stenography course and was looking for her first professional engagement. She arrived at his apartment on the morning of October 4th, 1866. The door opened, and she saw a man of 44, pale and thin, with a short beard and eyes that seemed focused on something slightly beyond whatever was immediately in front of him. The room behind him was in considerable disorder. Papers on every surface, books stacked against walls. The particular chaos of a place where thinking has been happening continuously and housekeeping has not. He greeted her with courtesy and distraction in equal measure. He explained the situation. A complete novel needed to be dictated in 26 days. Was she capable of that? She said she was. What happened in the following weeks was, at first, simply work. He dictated. she transcribed. They maintained the professional distance that the situation required. But in the intervals between sessions, in the brief conversations that formed around the edges of the task, something else began to develop. She was not impressed by him, not in the way that the salon world of St. Petersburg was impressed by him, not with the reflexive deference that literary fame tends to produce. She looked at what was actually in front of her, a man under severe pressure, clearly in difficulty, clearly brilliant, clearly in need of more help than a stenographer provided. She responded to what she saw rather than to what his reputation suggested she should see. He noticed this. He noticed it in the specific way that a person notices something they have not encountered before and cannot immediately name, not the attention of an admirer, not the careful neutrality of a professional, something more direct than either. She was simply present to what was actually happening in the room, and she expected him to be present to it as well. In the evenings, after the dictation sessions ended, she transcribed her shorthand notes into longhand in her own apartment and read what she was transcribing, not as a mechanical exercise, but as a person who was genuinely interested in what she was reading. She asked questions about the characters the next morning. She offered observations about the plot. She was engaged in a way that went beyond the professional minimum. He noticed this too, and something in the noticing, something quiet and not yet fully formed, began to settle in him like a decision he had not yet consciously made. They delivered the manuscript of The Gambler to Stelovsky's office on October 29th, 1866, 2 days before the deadline. The publisher received it without visible pleasure. The trap had not sprung. Dostoevsky returned to Crime and Punishment, which he completed and delivered in full by the end of 1866. The novel had been appearing in installments throughout the year, and the response from Russian readers was unlike anything he had experienced since Poor Folk. Not simply praise, recognition of a different order. Readers wrote to him, describing the experience of the novel as something that had changed something in them that could not easily be unchanged. He was 45 years old. He had written the first of the great novels. He proposed to Anna Snitkina in November of 1866. He did it obliquely, as he did most things that mattered to him, asking her to imagine a character in a novel, an aging writer who has fallen in love with a young woman, and asking what she thought the young woman should do. Anna understood immediately what was being asked. Without hesitation, she said yes. They were married in February of 1867. He was 45. She was 21. Everyone who knew Dostoevsky expected the marriage to follow the pattern of his first, deteriorating quickly under the pressure of debts and difficult temperament, and the tendency of his interior life to consume whatever surrounded it. Everyone was wrong. Some of the worst years were behind him. The best books were still ahead. And beside him now was the one person who had looked at everything he was and had decided, with full knowledge of what that meant, to stay. They left St. Petersburg in April of 1867 with 2 suitcases, a modest amount of borrowed money, and the intention of staying in Europe for 3 months. They would not return to Russia for 4 years and 3 months. The decision to leave had been Anna's. Practically speaking, the creditors who had been held at bay during their engagement arrived in force after the wedding. Stepson Pasha was presenting demands. Various relatives of his deceased brother Mikhail were also making claims on a man who had no reliable means of meeting them. The sum of what was owed was genuinely staggering for someone whose income depended entirely on what he could write and sell. In Russia, the creditors would continue to appear at the door. In Europe, they could not easily follow. They arrived in Dresden in the spring. The city was manageable in size and comfortable without being expensive, with a particular quality that certain European cities have of being genuinely pleasant to inhabit slowly. There were galleries and parks and streets quiet enough in the mornings to walk without feeling the pressure of a metropolis. Dostoevsky visited the Sistine Madonna in the Dresden Gallery repeatedly, standing before it with a stillness that Anna noted in her diary as something beyond ordinary aesthetic appreciation. He told her that Raphael's Madonna was the most perfect image of feminine beauty and spiritual purity that human hands had ever produced. He stood before it the way a man stands before something that confirms what he already believed but had not previously seen confirmed so completely. He was writing The Idiot. The central problem the novel posed was one he had known from the beginning would be among the most difficult he had ever attempted. He wanted to write a genuinely good man, not a figure whose goodness derived from distance from temptation, not a saint who had achieved virtue by retreating from the world, but a man who was fully present in ordinary social life, who participated in its arrangements and relationships and conflicts, and who was constitutionally, irreducibly good in ways that produced consequences rather than simply existing as a moral quality. The difficulty was both technical and philosophical. Evil moves in fiction. It generates conflict, drives narrative, produces the tension that keeps a reader engaged. Goodness, rendered directly, tends to produce a character who is either implausibly perfect, which readers reject as untrue, or so passive that nothing happens around them, which is the death of any story. Dostoevsky had been thinking about this problem for years, and the solution he arrived at was the one that only he would have reached to make the good man an epileptic, a figure marked by the condition that had shaped his own interior life for nearly 2 decades, and to have the goodness itself become a source of damage rather than simple benefit. Prince Mishkin arrives in St. Petersburg from a Swiss clinic where he has been receiving treatment. He is innocent in the specific sense that his years of illness have kept him outside ordinary social life long enough that he has not developed the protective mechanisms that social existence tends to produce. He cannot perform. He cannot manage the gap between what he feels and what he expresses that social life requires as a matter of course. And this inability, which in a simpler novel might have been presented as straightforward virtue, becomes in Dostoevsky's hands something more complex and more painful. Mishkin enters the world of St. Petersburg's drawing rooms, and his goodness does not redeem the people around him. It exposes them. It holds up, without intending to, a mirror to the gap between what they claim to be and what they are. The reflection is not comfortable for anyone, including Mishkin himself, who cannot prevent the suffering his presence produces, despite his genuine wish to help everyone he encounters. The writing went slowly. The exile years were not the sustained period of composition that the decision to leave Russia had theoretically promised, because the gambling intervened with a regularity that made extended residence in any single place difficult. The pattern repeated itself across the exile years with a consistency that requires description only once, because what happened in Wiesbaden happened again in Baden-Baden, and again in other cities across Germany and Switzerland. Dostoevsky would feel the pull of the casino. He would go. He would win in the early sessions. Often, because luck at roulette is not evenly distributed, and the early sessions frequently produce results that feel like confirmation of a system. The wins would deepen the conviction that the system was working. He would press further. The losses would begin. He would try to recover the losses with larger bets. The losses would accelerate. He would exhaust what he had brought. Then he would return to wherever Anna was waiting. The letters he sent from the casino cities during these years are among the more painful documents in Russian literary correspondence. They are written in the specific register of a man who understands exactly what he is doing and who asks for help anyway, with a desperation that is entirely genuine. He does not make excuses in these letters. He does not construct elaborate justifications. He describes what has happened with complete honesty, asks Anna to send what she can manage, and promises that something has been finally exhausted in him. He went back anyway. Anna's responses have also survived, and they are a study in a particular kind of love that has very little to do with romance in any conventional sense. She did not send letters of reproach. She did not issue ultimatums. She assessed what was possible, found what could be pawned or borrowed, sent it, and waited for him to return. When he returned, she did not make him endure extended expressions of disappointment. She moved forward. This was not passivity. It was an active choice, made repeatedly, by a woman who had seen her husband clearly from the beginning, and who had decided that what he was worth, the practical difficulties of being near him, she may have understood, in ways she did not articulate directly in her diary, that the compulsion was connected to something in him that predated her, and that could not be addressed through argument or consequence. She could not cure it. She could only create the conditions under which he might, eventually, exhaust it himself. In the spring of 1868, their first child was born in Geneva, a daughter. They named her Sonia. The weeks following her birth were among the happiest. Dostoevsky would record from the Exile years. He was moved by her existence in ways that his letters make clear. She represented something forward-looking in a life that had been largely organized around surviving what had already happened. Sonia died 3 months later, in May of 1868, of pneumonia. The grief was unlike the other losses he had carried. The deaths of his wife and his brother had been losses of adults, people who had lived their lives and whose suffering he could place, however painfully, within some larger framework of human experience. Sonia had been 3 months old. She had not yet had time to be anyone. As he described it to his friend Apollon Maikov in the weeks that followed, the world looked different after it, in a way that he could not fully explain and did not try to. He did not try to explain further. He did not need to. The question of innocent suffering, of children who die before they have had any opportunity to do anything to deserve their deaths, becomes in the work that follows Sonia's death not a philosophical position, but a personal wound. When Ivan Karamazov constructs his argument from the tears of children, when he catalogues the suffering of the innocent as the basis for his refusal of divine harmony, he is drawing on material that Dostoevsky had held in his body since Geneva in the spring of 1868. They moved from Geneva to Vevey, and from Vevey to Milan, and from Milan to Florence. Dostoevsky finished The Idiot in Florence in January of 1869. He was not satisfied with it. He felt that Mishkin had not quite achieved what he had been intended to achieve, that the goodness had slipped away from him at crucial moments, that the novel had not fully done what he had asked it to do. He was probably right, in the way that a writer is sometimes right about the partial failure of their own work. The Idiot is a great novel. It is also a novel that is aware of its own incompleteness, and that awareness gives it a quality that purely successful novels sometimes lack. Working through the problem of Mishkin had clarified something. The questions about what happens when genuine goodness is absent, when the vacuum left by the absence of faith or genuine moral conviction is filled by ideology or by the will to dominate, were coming into sharper focus. He began Demons in the fall of 1869, drawing on a news story that had reached him in Florence. A student named Ivan Ivanov had been murdered by his fellow members of a revolutionary cell led by a man named Sergei Nekhaev. Nekhaev had ordered the killing because he suspected Ivanov of insufficient loyalty to the cause. The murder had been carried out by the cell members collectively, who were thus implicated in the crime, and therefore, Nekhaev calculated, bound more firmly to the organization by their shared guilt. Dostoevsky was appalled in ways that went beyond ordinary moral revulsion. He saw in the story the logical endpoint of a line of reasoning he had been tracking for years. The reasoning that held that a sufficiently important end justified any means used to achieve it, that individuals could be sacrificed to the movement, that the moral constraints governing ordinary life did not apply to those engaged in the work of historical transformation. He had seen where this reasoning went. He had watched in Omsk what happened to men who had acted on it, had watched the stories those men told themselves about their actions, had watched those stories fail to provide what the men who constructed them had hoped they would provide. Their second surviving child, a daughter named Lyubov, was born in September of 1869 in Dresden, where they had returned from Italy. She was healthy and remained so. The presence of a living child altered the emotional atmosphere of the exile in ways that made the difficult things slightly more bearable. Their son, Fyodor, was born in July of 1871, and then, in the spring of that same year, something shifted. In Wiesbaden, in what Dostoevsky later described to Anna as his final session at the roulette table, he lost everything he had brought, wrote to her asking for what she could send, and then sat in his hotel room in the aftermath and felt something he had not felt after any of the previous sessions. Not remorse exactly, something closer to depletion, as if the thing in him that had needed the casino had finally consumed itself and had nothing left to consume. He wrote to Anna that he believed something had genuinely ended, that he felt it in a way that was different from the many previous times he had believed something had ended and it had not. Anna sent the money. He came home. He did not return to the casino. In the nearly 10 years of life remaining to him, through financial pressures, sometimes as severe as anything he had experienced during the exile years, he did not go back. Whatever the compulsion had needed, it had finally had enough. They made preparations to return to Russia. In July of 1871, Fyodor and Anna Dostoevsky boarded a train for St. Petersburg. They had been away for 4 years and 3 months. The exile was over. What awaited him in Russia was not the literary landscape he had left. It had continued to develop in his absence, and the questions it was asking were precisely the questions he had been working through across 4 difficult years. He was 50 years old. He had a living family and nearly 10 years free from the casino ahead of him, and 2 major novels still forming in his mind, and the specific clarity of a man who has survived enough to know exactly what he needs to say. Now he needed only to say it. St. Petersburg, in the summer of 1871 looked, at first glance, much as it had when they left it. The Neva still moved through the city with its flat grey indifference. The government buildings still lined the embankments with their imperial confidence. The literary world still conducted its arguments in the same journals and the same drawing rooms. But the city had changed in ways that became visible only gradually. The way changes in a person become visible when you have been away long enough to see them against the memory of what they were. The radical movements that had been developing throughout the 1860s had grown more organized and more extreme in their methods. Young men and women from educated families were moving into the countryside to live among the peasants, attempting to bring their revolutionary ideas directly to the people who were supposed to benefit from them. The peasants, for the most part, did not want what the revolutionaries were offering. The movement pressed on regardless. Dostoevsky watched all of this with the attentiveness of someone who had been thinking about it for a long time, and who was finishing a novel that was specifically about where it was going. Demons was published in serial form in Ruski Vestnik throughout 1871 and 1872, and its reception divided Russian intellectual life in ways that few novels had previously managed. The progressive critics were furious. They read it as a reactionary attack on the reform movement, as an attempt to discredit political activism by associating it with manipulation and murder. The conservative critics praised it for exactly the reasons the progressives condemned it, which was itself a problem. Since Dostoevsky did not consider himself a conservative in any simple sense, and did not want his novel read as a defence of the existing order, the difficulty was that Demons was doing something more complex than either side was prepared to acknowledge. The central figure of the novel, Stavrogin, was unlike any character Dostoevsky had previously created. He was not a villain in any recognizable sense. He was a man of extraordinary gifts, physical beauty, intelligence, personal magnetism, who had tried everything available to a man of his capacities and had found that nothing produced in him the response that experience was supposed to produce. He had been brave without feeling courage. He had loved without feeling love. He had committed acts of great generosity and acts of considerable cruelty, and had experienced both with the same fundamental emptiness. Stavrogin was the end point of a trajectory Dostoevsky had been tracing since Notes from Underground. If the underground man was the beginning of the argument, the man who had seen through the consoling fictions of progressive ideology but had nothing to replace them with, Stavrogin was its conclusion, the man who had genuinely achieved the freedom from conventional constraint that a certain kind of philosophical reasoning promises, and who had discovered that this freedom was indistinguishable from emptiness, that a self without obligations to anything beyond itself is not a liberated self, it is simply a self with nothing in it. Around Stavrogin, the novel arranged characters who drew from him their own ideological programs. Consider them in turn, because each one represents a different way that an idea can destroy a person. Pyotr Verkhovensky, based loosely on the historical Nekayev, was the revolutionary organizer who had taken the logic of political action to its most ruthless conclusions. Where Stavrogin was empty, Verkhovensky was full of purpose and method and the cold efficiency of a man who has decided that outcomes are the only thing that matters. He used Stavrogin's charisma as borrowed legitimacy for his own project of systematic destruction. Kirillov was the character who had followed the logic of godlessness to its philosophical extreme, and concluded that the only truly free act available to a man in a universe without God was his own voluntary death. His scenes are among the strangest and most quietly devastating in all of Dostoevsky's fiction. The portrait of a genuinely intelligent man, reasoning his way, step by careful step, to an abyss. Shatov was the man who had moved through the same ideological territory in the opposite direction and had arrived, battered and uncertain, at something that resembled faith, not a comfortable faith, not a triumphant one, but the faith of a man who has looked at the alternatives and found them worse. The murder of Shatov, ordered by Verkovensky and carried out by the cell members, was drawn directly from the Nekhaev case. Dostoevsky rendered it with a specificity that made clear he understood exactly what the killing represented. Not simply a crime, the logical consequence of a system of thought that had removed the individual from the category of the sacred. When Demons was complete, Dostoevsky accepted an offer to become the editor of a conservative journal called The Citizen. He was not a natural editor. He was also not straightforwardly conservative in the sense the journal's owners intended. But the position came with a salary, which was something he had not had for a long time. It also gave him a platform. He called what he began to write there the Diary of a Writer. It began as a regular column in The Citizen in 1873, and immediately distinguished itself from anything that Russian journalism had previously produced. It was not political commentary in any recognizable sense. It was not literary criticism, though it sometimes engaged with literary questions. It was not autobiography, though it drew extensively on his own history and observations. It was a conversation, a sustained, direct, intimate conversation between a writer and his readers, conducted across the printed page with a frankness that Russian readers had not previously encountered in a published form. The response was unlike anything in his previous literary experience. Letters arrived from readers across Russia in quantities that overwhelmed any single person's capacity to respond. They came from every social class and every region, from students and from peasants, from army officers and from factory workers, from women in provincial cities who had no access to any other intellectual community, and who had found in the diary something that addressed them directly as thinking human beings. They came from people in genuine crisis, people carrying griefs they had not been able to name before they encountered a writer who seemed to understand what those griefs were made of. Dostoevsky answered as many of them as he could, not with form responses, but with genuine letters, engaging with what had actually been said. He did not moralize. He did not offer easy consolation. He offered attention, which was the thing that most of his correspondents had not previously received from anyone with his capacity to give it. He understood, through these letters, something about the function of literature that he had been approaching theoretically for years, and that the reader mail made unmistakably concrete. He was not providing entertainment. He was not primarily providing ideas. He was providing a kind of witness, a sustained attention to the experience of being a human being in Russia in the 1870s that made readers feel, with a specificity that no abstract proposition could produce, that their experience had been seen. He left The Citizen in 1874 and revived The Diary of a Writer as an independent monthly publication, beginning in 1876, writing it, editing it, and publishing it himself. Anna managed the business side with the organized efficiency she brought to everything practical in their shared life. For the first time, something resembling financial stability was available to them, not comfort exactly, But the absence of the immediate catastrophe that had been his standard condition for the previous decade. Their domestic life during these years had a regularity that was new to him and that he found, to his own mild surprise, sustaining rather than confining. They spent summers in a small town called Staraya Russa in the Novgorod region, where they rented a house that eventually became their own property. The children ran through the fields and the birch forests in the way that Dostoevsky himself had run through the fields and birch forests of Daravoye in the summers of his childhood. The late afternoons at Staraya Russa had a particular quality he had not previously known in his adult life. Late sun across the yard, the sound of children somewhere nearby, the smell of grass and warm wood, something like peace, or the closest he had come to it. Their fourth child, a son named Alexei, was born in August of 1875. He was a healthy and lively boy, and Dostoevsky was more present for this child's early years than he had been for any of his others. He called him Alyosha. In May of 1878, Alyosha died. He was 2.5 years old. He died of an epileptic seizure, the same condition that had shaped his father's interior life for nearly 3 decades. The specific cruelty of this, as those close to him later recalled, was not something he could set aside. The disease that had given Dostoevsky those seconds of transcendent harmony before each seizure had now taken his son. He did not recover from this loss in the way that people are said to recover from losses. He moved forward because moving forward was the only available direction. But Alyosha stayed with him in the way that Sonia had stayed with him, as a permanent presence in the part of his consciousness where the questions that had no answers lived. His friend, the philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, took him shortly after Alyosha's death on a journey to the Optina Pustin monastery, one of the great centers of Orthodox spiritual life in Russia. Dostoevsky spent several days there in conversation with the elder Ambrose, a monk whose reputation for wisdom and compassion had drawn visitors from across the country for decades. The specific content of those conversations has not survived in any detailed record. What has survived is Dostoevsky's account of the experience as one of the most significant of his life. He returned to St. Petersburg and sat down in the fall of 1878 to begin the novel that he understood from the start would be his last. He knew what it needed to be. He had been preparing for it. Without knowing he was preparing for it. Since the morning, his mother read him the Book of Job in the hospital apartment in Moscow, every novel he had written, every character he had constructed, every question he had turned over in the long nights of Omsk, and the exile years and the years of the diary, had been rehearsal for this one. He was 56 years old. His health was uncertain. The notebooks he kept during these months show a man working with a clarity of intention that his earlier books, for all their greatness, had not quite possessed from the beginning. He began to write, and somewhere in the apartment on Kuznechny Lane, Anna was managing everything else so that the writing could happen. Before the great final novel arrived in its full form, something was happening to Dostoevsky through the years of the diary of a writer that requires its own accounting, because it shaped the person who sat down in 1878 to write the Brothers Karamazov. He had become a figure to whom ordinary people brought their most serious questions. Not simply a famous writer, something closer to what an earlier era might have called a spiritual father, though he would have resisted the term. A figure whose readers wrote to him not as fans to a celebrity, but as people in genuine need, to someone they believed might understand what genuine need felt like from the inside. One letter, which he kept and which survived among his papers, came from a young woman in Moscow. She was training to be a teacher. She had grown up in a religious household and had somewhere along the way lost the faith that had organized her early life, and she had found nothing to replace it. The loss had been gradual, almost imperceptible, until one morning she woke up and understood that the interior structure she had been living inside was no longer there. She wrote to Dostoevsky, not asking for theology or argument. She asked him how a person continued to live honestly in the world without the certainty that the world was worth living in. He answered her. He did not answer with doctrine. He answered with the specific and careful attention of someone who had asked the same question himself, in different rooms and different decades, and who knew that the honest answer was not a resolution but a direction. The letter was not unique. It was representative of thousands. A student in Kazan wrote to him about his father, who was dying slowly and in considerable pain, and who had stopped believing in anything and had become, in his dying, very difficult to love. He asked Dostoevsky whether it was possible to honor someone you could no longer admire. A retired army officer in Kiev wrote to describe the specific loneliness of a man who has outlived everyone he trusted and who finds that the world has reorganized itself around concerns he cannot share. A woman in Odessa whose son had been arrested for political activities wrote to ask what she was supposed to feel about a country that could do this to her child. Dostoevsky answered as many of them as he could, not with form responses, but with genuine letters, engaging with what had actually been said. He did not moralize. He offered attention, which was the thing that most of his correspondents had not previously received from anyone with his capacity to give it. He understood, through these letters, something about the function of literature that he had been approaching theoretically for years, and that the reader male made unmistakably concrete. He was not providing entertainment. He was not primarily providing ideas. He was providing a kind of witness, a sustained attention to the experience of being a human being in Russia in the 1870s that made readers feel, with a specificity that no abstract proposition could produce, that their experience had been seen. The diary itself ranged across wider territory than any single publication of its era. He wrote about crime. The criminal trials reported in the Russian press gave him material that he used not for sensationalism, but for the kind of analysis that was his deepest subject. He was interested in what the criminal's interior experience looked like from the inside, in the mechanisms by which a person arrived at an act that the society around them defined as transgressive. These were not abstract questions for Dostoevsky. They were questions he had been living with since the hospital in Moscow, since Omsk, since the years of writing Raskolnikov from the inside out. He wrote about children with a ferocity that was not rhetorical. When he wrote about cases of child abuse, about the ways in which Russian society in the 1870s failed to protect its most vulnerable members, he wrote with an urgency that some readers found excessive and that others found to be the only appropriate response to facts that deserved urgency. In the summer of 1876, he published in the diary a short story called The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, a man who has decided that nothing matters, who has concluded that the universe is indifferent to human suffering, and that this indifference makes all human action equally meaningless. Encounters, through a dream, a vision of humanity before corruption. He corrupts it. He watches it become, step by step, a version of the world he came from. The story was a working out. in compressed form, of the central question of the Brothers Karamazov. What does it mean to say that human beings matter when nothing in the observable universe confirms that they do? He was writing toward these questions from every direction he could find. The speech he gave in Moscow in June of 1880 was the culmination of this period of his public life, and it produced a response that the major figures of Russian intellectual life who were present described. In the days and weeks afterward, as unlike anything they had previously witnessed at a literary or public occasion, the event was the unveiling of a monument to Alexander Pushkin. Turgenev had spoken the day before and had been received with enthusiasm by the progressive faction and coolness by the conservatives. The tension between the two camps was visible and not entirely comfortable. Dostoevsky spoke on June 8th, 1880. He spoke about Pushkin as the embodiment of a specifically Russian genius, a genius for universal sympathy, for the capacity to enter fully into the experience of other peoples and other cultures without losing its own essential nature. He spoke about what this quality meant and what it might offer the world. He spoke about suffering and about what genuine suffering, honestly carried and honestly examined, could produce in a person and in a culture. The response was immediate and overwhelming in a way that none of those present had anticipated. People in the audience began to weep. Turgenev, who had come prepared to maintain the dignified disagreement of a lifetime, embraced him on the platform. Strangers in the hall embraced each other. Dostoevsky wrote to Anna from Moscow that evening. He told her that something extraordinary had occurred. He told her he did not entirely understand it. He told her he had said what he believed to be true, as directly as he knew how, and that it had reached people in a way he had not expected. He was back in St. Petersburg within days, at his desk, working on the chapter in which Ivan Karamazov presents his catalogue of the suffering of children and asks his younger brother whether any future harmony could justify the present tears of a single tortured child. The pages were accumulating. He kept writing. He began the novel in the fall of 1878 with a clarity of intention that his previous books, for all their greatness, had not quite possessed from the start. He told Anna that the Brothers Karamazov would be his answer to everything, not a definitive answer, not the kind of answer that closes a question and makes it no longer worth asking, the most honest and complete statement he could make of what he had come to understand about the condition of being human, about the coexistence in that condition of the capacity for the most terrible darkness and the capacity for something that deserved, however cautiously, to be called grace. The novel is set in a provincial Russian town over a period of several weeks. Its external plot is a murder mystery of a classical kind. A father is killed. The eldest son is accused. The question of who actually committed the murder and why, and what the consequences reveal about the people involved and about the society that produced them, drives the narrative forward with the momentum of a story that is genuinely gripping at the level of plot, even as it operates simultaneously at every other available level. But the murder and the trial are the container. The content is the three brothers themselves. Dmitri, the eldest of the legitimate sons, is the man of the body, of passion and appetite and the immediate force of feeling. He loves and hates and desires with an intensity that his intelligence cannot fully manage. He wants the woman Grushenka with a completeness that overrides every other consideration. He hates his father with a directness that leaves no room for the ambivalence that most people manage to arrange around their parental relationships. He is, in the most immediate sense, the most alive of the three brothers, and also the one whose aliveness most consistently puts him in danger. Ivan is the man of the mind. He is 30 years old. He has a first-class education and a capacity for sustained argument that places him among the most formidable intellectual presences in all of Dostoevsky's fiction. He does not believe in God, not because he has not thought carefully about the question, but because he has thought about it more carefully than most people and has arrived at a position that is not dismissive of religion, but something more challenging, a refusal to accept the terms on which divine harmony is offered. Ivan's argument, which he presents to his younger brother Alyosha in the chapter called Rebellion, deserves to be understood on its own terms before considering how the novel responds to it. He does not argue that God does not exist. He argues that even if God exists, even if the divine harmony that theology promises is real and will ultimately be achieved, he cannot accept it. His reason is specific. The harmony, if it is achieved, will be achieved over the suffering of children, over the tears of children who cannot understand why they are suffering and who have not consented to serve as necessary material for the construction of any future paradise. Ivan catalogues these cases with a deliberateness that is not rhetorical flourish, but something closer to prosecutorial evidence. Children beaten by their parents. A small girl locked in an outhouse through a winter night. A child hunted across a snowfield by dogs in front of her mother. He asks Alyosha whether he would accept the architect's role in a world where the foundations of ultimate harmony required even one child's tears. He asks it as a genuine question. He waits. Alyosha says quietly that he would not accept it. Ivan says, "Then how can you accept God?" This is the challenge that the entire novel must answer. And Dostoevsky understood, with complete clarity, that a philosophical counter-argument was not the answer, could not be the answer. Because the philosophical counter-arguments were available and Ivan had disposed of most of them before making his case, the answer, if there was one, had to come from a different direction entirely. He had known this for years. He had known it since Optina Pustin, since the conversations with the elder Ambrose, since he had watched the peasant prisoners at Omsk pray with the immediate, unsophisticated faith of people who did not have the option of resolving the problem of suffering theoretically because they were living inside it. The answer was not an argument. It was a demonstration, and it required a character rather than a proposition to carry it. Alyosha Karamazov is 20 years old when the novel begins. He is a novice monk, a student of the elder Zosima, a young man whose goodness is not the goodness of inexperience. He has seen enough of his family's chaos to have no illusions about human nature. His goodness is the goodness of a person who has found, without being entirely able to explain how, a way of being present to other people that does not require them to be other than they are. He goes where he is needed. He listens without judgment. He does not offer theological propositions in response to suffering. He offers presence, the specific quality of attention that makes another person feel, without being told, that their experience has been witnessed and that the witnessing matters. Dostoevsky knew that this was not a logical answer to Ivan's argument. Alyosha does not refute Ivan. He cannot refute him. The children's tears are real. The suffering Ivan catalogues is real. The question of why a God capable of preventing it permits it is not answered by the existence of a young monk who is genuinely kind. And yet the novel insists, through the accumulated weight of its attention to how Alyosha moves through the world, that the question and the life can coexist, that Ivan's position is logically airtight and humanly impossible to inhabit, that only one of these two orientations can actually sustain a human being over time. Ivan understands this about himself. The understanding drives him toward the breakdown that the novel traces with a precision that reflects Dostoevsky's own experience of what the mind does to itself when it follows its logic all the way to the place where logic stops, being sufficient. The chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, which Ivan presents as a poem he has composed in his head, is the philosophical and literary peak of Dostoevsky's entire body of work. It imagines Christ returning to Seville during the Spanish Inquisition. He performs miracles. He is recognized by the people. He is arrested by the Grand Inquisitor, a 90-year-old cardinal who has spent his life managing the Church's relationship with the human need for meaning and authority. The room where they meet is small and still. The old man carries a candle. He looks at the figure before him for a long moment without speaking. Then he begins. The Inquisitor argues that Christ made a mistake in the desert when he refused the 3 temptations. What human beings actually want, the Inquisitor says, is not the burden of freedom, but the comfort of authority, not the terrifying responsibility of choosing their own lives, but the reassurance of being told how to live. The Church has corrected Christ's error. It has taken the freedom that Christ insisted on offering and converted it into the security that people actually need. And now Christ has returned, potentially to undo this merciful correction. The Inquisitor finishes. He has made the argument as well as it can be made. He waits for Christ's response. The room is silent. The candle burns. Outside, the city continues. Christ crosses the cell in silence and kisses the old man on his bloodless lips. The Inquisitor shudders. He opens the door and says, "Go, and come no more." Christ walks out into the dark streets of the city. Dostoevsky had been working toward this scene since the night in Semyonovsky Square. The kiss is not an argument. It does not refute the Inquisitor's case, which is in its own terms unanswerable. It does something different. It offers love to the man who has constructed the most sophisticated possible case against the necessity of love. And it offers it without conditions and without requiring any particular response. The Inquisitor shudders because the kiss reaches something in him that his argument has not managed to eliminate. He knows it, and he opens the door anyway. Father Zosima, who dies early in the novel and whose teachings Alyosha carries forward, was drawn partly from Dostoevsky's encounter with the elder Ambrose and partly from the accumulated observation of decades. Zosima teaches, in terms that are simple rather than systematic, that every person is responsible to every other person for everything. Not a comfortable teaching. It insists on a radical interconnectedness that makes the suffering of any human being the concern of every other. It is the theological expression of what Dostoevsky had understood since Omsk, that the man in the next bunk is not separate from you in any way that your shared humanity does not bridge. Smerdyakov, the illegitimate 4th son of old Fyodor Karamazov, is the character who kills the father. He is Ivan's student, the man who has listened to Ivan's arguments about the arbitrariness of moral constraint and has drawn from them the conclusion that Ivan himself drew but was not willing to act on that if God does not exist. Everything is permitted. He kills the father. He tells Ivan what he has done. He hangs himself. Ivan's breakdown follows the revelation with the inevitability of a man confronting the logical consequences of his own thought made concrete and irrevocable. This is what Dostoevsky had been working toward since Notes from Underground. Not the argument. The consequence, not the theory. The life that follows from it. The trial of Dmitri, who is accused of the murder that Smerdyakov committed, takes up the final section of the novel. The prosecution and the defense both offer accounts of Dmitri that are internally coherent and entirely miss the essential truth of who he is. The jury finds him guilty of a murder he did not commit. Justice, in the formal institutional sense, fails completely. The novel does not flinch from this. It simply continues. Because the questions it is asking do not depend on institutional justice for their resolution, Dostoevsky published the novel in monthly installments in Ruski Vestnik throughout 1879 and 1880. He finished the final chapters in November of 1880, 31 years after he had stood in the white shroud in Semyonovsky Square. He wrote in a letter to a reader who had asked about the novel's intention that he had tried to answer the question that Ivan asked. He said he was not certain he had succeeded. He said the answer he had offered. The answer that was the kiss rather than a counter-argument was the most honest answer he knew how to give. He had not failed. The final pages of the Brothers Karamazov left his desk in November of 1880, and the apartment on Kuznetny Lane became, for a few weeks, something that resembled quiet, not silence exactly. Never quite silence in that apartment, but something slower, something with more space in it, the particular quality of a place where the urgent work has been completed and what remains is the space after it. He sat in the evenings. He read letters from readers who had followed the novel through its months of serialization and who wrote now to tell him what it had meant to them. A young man who had lost his faith and found in Ivan's argument the most honest statement of his own position, and in Alyosha something he could not yet name but could not dismiss. A woman in Kazan whose son had died and who wrote that the chapter on Zosima had given her the first genuine comfort she had found. A student who wrote simply, "I feel less alone." He answered what he could. The others he kept. He was planning the sequel. He had told readers in the preface to the novel that the story of Alyosha Karamazov was only beginning, that the young man they had encountered as a novice monk would return in a second volume as a man moving through the larger world, testing the teachings of Zosima against the full complexity of Russian social reality. He discussed the plan with Anna with a specificity that suggests he was not performing optimism, but genuinely believed the time to write it existed. He made notes. He wrote fragments. He sat at his desk in the evenings, and the lamplight fell across the pages and outside the January cold, pressed against the windows of St. Petersburg. On the evening of January 25th, 1881, while he was at his desk, a small hemorrhage announced itself. He called for Anna. She came quickly and sat beside him. His hands were steadier than hers. He slept that night and seemed, in the morning, somewhat recovered. Anna was not reassured. She had watched him carefully enough across 14 years of marriage to read the signs that his condition produced with a precision that went beyond what any doctor had told her. She knew that the appearance of recovery was not the same as recovery. The 26th passed quietly. He received a few visitors in the afternoon and participated in the conversations with an attention that those who came noted afterward as striking. He seemed more present than usual, more focused on what was immediately in the room. In the evening, he spoke to Anna about the children, about what they would need. He spoke with the practical seriousness of a man who is making certain that what needs to be said is said, not with the dramatic intensity of a prepared farewell, but with the quiet attention to necessary things of someone completing a task. He asked her to read to him from the New Testament. She took the small volume. She read from the passage in Matthew where John the Baptist sends his disciples to ask Christ whether he is the one who was to come, or whether they should expect someone else. And Christ answers, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." The room was quiet. The candle made its small light. Outside, the January cold pressed against the windows. Anna recorded in her memoirs that after she finished reading, Dostoevsky was silent for a moment. Then he said, quietly, that was the one, that was the passage. He slept. On the morning of January 28th, 1881, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky died of pulmonary hemorrhage. He was 59 years old. Anna was beside him. She sat with him for a long time after. The apartment on Kuznechny Lane was still. The sounds of the city came through the walls, as they always had. The sounds of a world continuing without adjustment for what had just ended inside a particular set of walls. The news reached St. Petersburg within hours. By the following morning it had travelled across Russia, carried by telegraph and by the specific speed with which significant news travels in a country that has been waiting, without knowing it, to hear something. The funeral was held on February 1st, 1881. The procession that accompanied his body through the streets of St. Petersburg moved for several hours. No one had organized the crowd in any formal sense. The people who appeared had come because they wanted to be there. The estimates of those present vary across the accounts that survive. Some put the number at 30,000. Others suggest more. What is consistent across all the accounts is not the number, but the quality of the crowd's presence. The specific seriousness of people who are not performing public grief, but expressing something genuine. A young woman who had read Crime and Punishment at 16 and had understood, for the first time, something about her own interior life that she had not previously had words for. An old man who had himself been a prisoner in Siberia and who had read The House of the Dead with the recognition of a person encountering their own experience rendered by someone who had been there. Students from the universities who argued about his ideas with a passion that was itself a form of tribute. A student choir sang as the procession moved. The hymns rose into the January air over the city. People along the route removed their hats and stood in the cold until the procession passed. He was buried in the Tikhvin cemetery at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, in the section reserved for Russian writers and artists of distinction. The grave was marked simply, only the dates and the name. Anna did not remarry. She devoted the years following his death to organizing and preserving his work, to ensuring that the manuscripts he had left behind reached the readers who needed them. She wrote her own memoirs of their marriage, patient and clear-eyed, published decades later, which remain among the most valuable documents for understanding the man behind the work. She survived him by 37 years. She lived until 1918, on his desk when he died. Alongside the notes for the unwritten sequel was a small copy of the New Testament, the same edition, or one like it, to the copy that the women at Tobolsk had pressed into his hands on the Christmas Eve night 31 years earlier as the sleigh moved through the frozen streets of St. Petersburg toward Siberia. It was worn from use. The world did not immediately know what to do with Dostoevsky. This is not unusual. The writers who reach deepest tend to require the most time for their reach to be fully understood. The reading public that filled the streets of St. Petersburg in February of 1881 understood that something significant had been lost. The literary and philosophical establishments of the following decades were less certain about what exactly it had been. In Russia, the question of his legacy was complicated almost immediately by politics. The conservatives claimed him as a defender of Orthodox Christianity and Russian nationalism. The progressives, who had never forgiven demons, continued to regard him with suspicion. The radicals, whose movement he had spent his later career examining with uncomfortable precision, preferred to treat him as a reactionary whose religious commitments disqualified his social observations. None of these claims were entirely wrong. None of them were sufficient. The revaluation came from outside Russia first, and it came quickly. Friedrich Nietzsche encountered Dostoevsky's work in the late 1880s. The account of how it happened has been preserved in his correspondence. He picked up a French translation of Notes from Underground in a bookshop in Nice, began reading it that afternoon, and could not put it down. He wrote to a friend the following day that he had found, in this strange Russian writer, the only psychologist from whom he had something to learn. He meant something specific by this. Dostoevsky had gone further into the actual mechanics of human motivation, into the specific ways in which people deceive themselves and construct justifications for what they want to do, and experience the gap between their stated values and their actual behaviour, than anyone else Nietzsche had read. The underground man anticipated, by 2 decades, the critique of consciousness that Nietzsche was building from different philosophical materials. 2 men, in different languages and different countries, following the same question to the same uncomfortable place. Sigmund Freud came to Dostoevsky through the Brothers Karamazov, which he described in an essay published in 1928 as the most magnificent novel ever written. He was not given to such unqualified praise. His essay on Dostoevsky and the theme of parricide, which examined the novel and its author's relationship to questions of guilt and paternal authority, is among the more interesting documents in the history of psychoanalytic literary criticism. Not because all of its specific claims are correct, but because it demonstrates the degree to which Dostoevsky had anticipated, through the instruments of fiction, the territory that Freud was mapping through the instruments of clinical observation. The question Freud was asking, what the unconscious mind actually contains and how its contents shape behaviour in ways the conscious mind cannot directly observe, was a question that Dostoevsky had been asking since The Double in 1846. He had no theory of the unconscious, no clinical vocabulary, no systematic framework. What he had was an attention to the gap between what his characters said they were doing and what they were actually doing, between the reasons they gave for their behaviour and the forces actually driving it. That was so precise and so consistent that the psychologists who came after him recognized it as empirically accurate in ways that went beyond any literary intention. Albert Camus read Dostoevsky and found in him the writer who had most honestly confronted the condition of being a human being who demands meaning in a universe that does not provide it. The Grand Inquisitor chapter appears in Camus's thinking as one of the central documents of the human situation, the place where the question of freedom and happiness and the cost of each was posed with the greatest possible clarity. The fact that Dostoevsky ultimately came down on the side of faith while Camus did not is, in Camus's reading, less important than the honesty with which both the question and the answer were handled. Franz Kafka, William Faulkner, Jean-Paul Sartre, all of them acknowledged a debt that was not the debt of influence in the narrow sense, but the debt of encounter, the recognition that this writer had been somewhere they needed to go and had left behind something that made the journey possible. In the 20th century, Dostoevsky's influence on literature became so pervasive that it became, in some respects, invisible, the way the influence of a river on a landscape becomes invisible once the landscape has fully taken the shape the river gave it. The interior monologue techniques that came to define literary modernism were not invented by him, but they were anticipated by him. In the underground man's running self-commentary, and in the fractured rhythms of Raskolnikov's consciousness as it moves through the streets of St. Petersburg in the days following the murder, the existentialist movement that dominated European philosophy and literature in the decades following the Second World War drew heavily on Dostoevsky, even when it did not say so directly. The questions of freedom and responsibility and authenticity and the experience of anxiety in a world without guaranteed meaning that the existentialists made their central concerns were questions that Dostoevsky had been asking since 1844. He had asked them in the form of fiction rather than philosophy, which meant that his versions came accompanied by specific human faces and specific human histories, which made them both more immediate and considerably harder to systematize. The rehabilitation of his reputation in Russia itself, complicated throughout the Soviet period by his prescient criticism of the revolutionary program, proceeded slowly and unevenly through the 20th century. By the end of the Soviet period, the argument that he was a reactionary thinker had become difficult to sustain in the face of the full body of his work. Since the society that had dismissed him as a defender of the old order had itself produced exactly the configuration of ideology and violence and the subordination of individuals to the movement that he had spent his career warning against, a reader who comes to Dostoevsky today brings the same question that readers in every intervening generation have brought. Why does this still feel urgent? Why does a novel written by a Russian man in the 1860s and 70s feel as if it is describing something happening now, in this city, in this year, possibly in this room? The answer is not simply that human nature is constant, though it is more constant than either optimists or pessimists tend to acknowledge. The answer is more specific. Dostoevsky understood something about the interior life of human beings that most writers, even very good ones, do not fully understand. He understood that people do not experience themselves from the outside. They experience themselves from the inside, which means they have access to information about their own motivations and desires and fears that is not available from any external observation, and that this information is frequently in conflict with the version of themselves that they present to others, and often to themselves. He understood that the gap between these two versions, between the person as experienced from inside and the person as presented to the world, is the site of the most significant and most painful human experience, and he understood how to write from inside that gap. This is what Raskolnikov feels like from inside. This is what the underground man sounds like. This is why Ivan Karamazov's argument lands with the force it lands with, not only because it is a well-constructed philosophical position, which it is, but because it is the interior experience of a specific human being, felt at the temperature at which he actually feels it. When a reader encounters these books for the first time, the experience is frequently described not as reading about someone else, but as recognizing something, not the specific circumstances, which are particular to 19th century Russia, and could not be further from the experience of most contemporary readers. The recognition is of the interior structure, the specific configuration of longing and self-deception, and genuine aspiration, and genuine darkness that the books are made of. The reader recognizes it because they live there too, in the same interior space, with the same competing voices, with the same gap between the self they present and the self they experience. This is Dostoevsky's gift and his method and his ongoing relevance. He made a map of somewhere that every human being lives, and that very few writers have had the honesty and the technical capacity to describe directly. The map is not complete. He knew it was not complete. The sequel he did not live to write would have added to it. But what exists is enough to navigate by, enough to make a person who is struggling with the gap between what they believe and what they feel, between what they want to be and what they find themselves being, understand that the struggle is not a personal failure. It is a structural feature of the human condition. The boy from the hospital in Moscow carried that understanding into everything he wrote. He carried it through Siberia, and through the exile years, and through the deaths of children, and through every night at the desk, past the point where a more sensible person would have slept. He stood before a firing squad at 28 years old and understood, in the seconds between the drums and the arriving rider, that life was the only question worth asking about. He spent the next 3 decades answering it, not with a solution, with the most honest account of the question he could manage. And somewhere in the still air of a winter night, in St. Petersburg, or somewhere very like it, a young man is walking through the streets with a theory in his head and a crime in his recent past, and the city is pressing in on him from every direction. A woman is sitting in a small room in a provincial city, reading, finding for the first time that what she has been living through has a name and a shape. An old man is opening a book he has read before, returning to it because he knows that whatever he finds there will be more honest than most of what the day has offered him. The underground is still speaking. The brothers are still arguing. The old man in the cell is still making his case, and the figure before him is still crossing the room in silence to offer something that no argument can provide and no argument can take away. For Dostoevsky, perhaps, it had to be this way. The question could not be closed. It could only be carried, honestly, all the way to the end. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to Legends Uncovered. Which brother are you?